By sunrise in 1923, just outside Laredo, Texas, every head of cattle walked back through the gate on its own. They came calm, unhurt, their hides clean of dust and their eyes steady, as if they had merely circled the near pasture instead of pushing out toward the thorn fence and the scrub line where no trails end and few men go twice. His horse came back too, its coat dark with sweat, the saddle cinched tight, the reins dragging through ochre dirt, and the leather of the seat still warm enough to leave a mark on a palm if anyone had dared to touch it so soon after dawn. But the man who rode out before dark, when the first cattle stirred and needed pushing toward the water tank before the day heat could crack their hooves, was not in the saddle anymore, and the ground by the cattle gate where the herd had churned and wheeled and turned back toward the pens showed no boot prints at all, only hoof marks, only the scored earth where 400 pounds of flesh and rope and labor had circled and doubled back. No heel strike, no toe push, no sign that any man had ever dismounted, walked, stumbled, or run from that place. His name was James Vetter. He was 34 years old and had worked that ranch since 1918, which meant he had outlasted 3 foremen, 5 hands who drank themselves away, and 2 springs of drought that left the water tank so low you could see the skull of a steer that had gone down in 21 and never came up. He was the kind of man you trusted to work alone in the dark, steady, not given to noise or complaint. He had a wife named Catherine. She was called Kate among the hands, and they had 2 daughters, ages 9 and 6, and a son coming in the fall if the baby held. Kate waited on the porch of the ranch cottage every morning until she saw him come back in the first gray light, sometimes leading a calf that had split from the herd, sometimes just riding quiet with the dust still settling on his shoulders. On the morning of that date, she saw the horse come back without him. She saw the empty saddle the way a woman sees a letter sealed but unopened, and she went very still. The older hands found the branding iron pinned to the fence post nearest the gate. It was one of the double iron tools, the kind you heat in a fire pit and lean into hide to mark the ranch's letter, a simple cross with a tail bent like an old man's finger. The iron was still smoking. Not smoking like a pipe that's been left on a shelf, smoking like something brought from the fire just minutes past, like someone had heated it, pulled it from the coals, and set it exactly where it would be found. The fire pit itself, where they burned mesquite and kept the iron hot all night and into the early hours, was stone dead. The coals were white ash and ice-crusted with morning frost. The water bucket beside it had a skin of ice so thick that old Manuel, who first checked it, had to break it with the flat of an axe. There was no heat anywhere near that fire pit except in that branding iron, and it was still smoking in air cold enough to crack bone. Men in Laredo, Texas still won't talk about what the iron looked like close. The ones who are still alive, and there are only 3 or 4 now very old, they say it was clean. No burnt flesh on it, no hair ash. Just the tool itself, impossibly hot, impossibly smoking, and positioned with its handle facing the direction James Vetter had ridden out, as if he had left it there himself, as if he had heated it one last time and then climbed back onto his horse and rode toward the thorn fence and the scrub line and the place where no trails end, and you don't come back from before sunrise. Not alone and not without something else following behind you, something that doesn't leave footprints and doesn't answer to a name. By full sunrise, they had found Kate still standing on the porch. The ranch foreman was already ringing the bell in the tower to call in the hands from the far fields. Men were saddling horses. The word missing had not been spoken yet, but it was moving through the ranch like dust in wind, like the smell of something burnt that no one could quite place. The old hands in Laredo, Texas told the young ones after that, "You don't ride that fence line alone, not before sunrise. Not in the dark when the herd is moving and you need to bring them back in. The cattle know something we don't. The ground knows something we don't. And there's a smoking iron somewhere in time that hasn't cooled down yet. Not in all the years since. Not in 1923. Not in 1924. Not now." That's what they said. That's what they still say. They found James Vetter's house empty of him by 7 in the morning. Kate had sent their oldest daughter down to the bunkhouse to tell the foreman that James had not come back, and within minutes the news had moved through the hands like a rope pulled tight. The foreman, a man named Garrett Coates, rode out to the gate and stood looking at the smoking iron still pinned to the post. He did not touch it. He looked at the hoof churn, the empty saddle, the horse standing hip-shot and exhausted near the water trough, and then he rode back to the ranch house and began to organize the search without saying a word about what he suspected or what he feared. The timeline, as the hands pieced it together in the hours after, was this. James had saddled at 3:45 in the morning, which was 20 minutes earlier than usual. Manuel, the oldest hand, said he had heard the leather creak and the bit jingle in the stable. He was checking something, Manuel said later. I heard him talking to the horse soft-like, the way he did when something wasn't right. By 4:15, James had ridden out toward the pens where the night herd was being held. The herd was restless that week. A storm was coming down from the north, and cattle can smell it in the air days before the clouds arrive. 3 hands, working the near fence to keep the cattle calm, said they heard his whistle at 4:30. It was the 2-note cattle whistle he always used, a sound like a hawk's cry but sharp, and pitched to carry. I heard him clear, one of them said. Clear as if he was standing right next to me. His name was Thomas Reeves, and he was 23 years old and had been working the ranch for only 6 months. I heard him call the herd. I heard them start to move, then nothing for maybe 15 minutes, and when I looked toward the fence line, they were coming back on their own. No rider, no whistle, just walking like they knew exactly where they needed to be. By 6 in the morning, the herd was already back in the pens. They were calm. Their breathing was normal. There were no signs they had run or panicked or been driven hard toward any gate or break in the fence. It was as if they had been out for a quiet walk and had simply decided to come home. But no one had seen James Vetter since the whistle at 4:30. No one had seen him ride back. The horse had come in alone, still saddled, leather still warm, and James was gone. Garrett Coates rang the bell in the tower at 6:30, 3 long tolls that meant all hands to the ranch yard, and within an hour, he had 12 men saddled and ready. He divided them into 2 groups. The first group would search the immediate pasture and the area around the thorn fence where James had been heading. The second group would check the ravines and the far scrub line to the north, where a man could fall into a cut and be hidden by mesquite and stone. Kate stood on the porch with her shawl pulled tight, and she watched them ride out without saying anything. One of the younger hands, a boy named Petty who was only 19, looked back at her as they passed the gate, and he said later that her face looked like it had turned to stone. Not crying, not moving, just waiting for the bell to ring twice, which was the signal that they had found him. The search party moved through the dry pasture in a line, their horses walking slow and steady, the men calling out his name. James. James Vetter. The morning air was still cool, but the sun was rising fast, and you could already feel the heat beginning to climb out of the ground. They had lanterns with them even though it was full daylight. Old men know that you might need light where you don't expect to need it, and Garrett Coates was an old man. They had also brought 3 dogs, good tracking animals that belonged to the ranch, and they had tied strips of white cloth to the fence posts as they moved, marking the area they had already covered so they wouldn't search twice over the same ground. The first dog stopped at the cattle gate. It was a hound named Copper, a red dog that had worked cattle for 5 years and had never refused a scent or a command. But when they reached the gate where the smoking iron had been removed and pinned to a post farther back, Copper sat down in the dust and would not move. The other 2 dogs, coming up behind, did the same thing. They sat and they began to whine, low, urgent whines that came from somewhere deep in their chests. What is it? Garrett asked. And Thomas Reeves knelt down to check the animals, but there was nothing visible. Nothing he could see or smell or touch that would explain why all 3 dogs had frozen at the same spot. They won't go past here, Thomas said. Look at them. They're scared of something. Manuel was the one who noticed that the ground near the gate had changed. He knelt and ran his hand over the dirt, and his face went quiet in a way that made Petty, the young hand, move closer to look. There were boot prints here this morning, Manuel said. When we first found the horse, I remember looking at them. They were prints where a man would step down from a saddle, where he would land, but they're gone now. Gone like someone came and brushed them out smooth, or like they were never there at all. Nobody answered him. The dogs kept whining. The wind came down from the north with the smell of rain still hours away, And for a moment the only sound was the jingle of bridle bits and the soft creak of leather as the men sat their horses and looked at the ground that should have held footprints but didn't. That's when they heard it, a sound carried on the wind from somewhere past the thorn fence. It was a whistle, a two-note whistle, sharp and hawk-like, exactly like the one James Vetter always used to call the herd. It came once and then it stopped. When the dogs heard it, they stood up and began to back away, their eyes fixed on something past the fence line, their mouths tight and their ears pinned back the way an animal's ears go when it sees something it doesn't have words for and doesn't want to see again. "Nobody moves toward that fence," Garrett said. His voice was very quiet. "Nobody answers that whistle. You hear me? Nobody goes past the thorn posts." But as they turned their horses to regroup and plan a different search, Thomas Reeves pointed toward the fence posts that they had marked with white cloth strips only an hour before. 3 of the strips had disappeared. They had been tied tight. Thomas himself had tied 2 of them, but now they were just gone, as if someone had ridden along the fence line in the time since they had marked it and had untied each one and carried them away. Only the cloth was missing. The posts were still there, the string intact where it had been tied, but the white cloth that marked their search was gone. And in its place, on one post farther down the line, where they hadn't walked yet and hadn't marked, there was a fresh strip of white cloth, newly tied, positioned exactly at eye level for a man riding past on horseback. The search party stopped where they stood. The horses began to shift and stamp. Garrett looked at Manuel, and Manuel looked at the fence line, and then Garrett ordered them to dismount and walk the perimeter on foot, moving shoulder to shoulder through the scrub, their eyes on the ground for any sign of James Vetter's body or clothing or any other evidence of what might have happened when a man rode out into the dark with a herd of cattle and came back as smoke rising from an iron that had no earthly reason to be hot. By midday, they had covered 3 miles of ground in a grid pattern. They had seen nothing. They had found nothing. But by 2 in the afternoon, when they regrouped near the far ravine to rest the horses and drink water, every one of them reported the same thing. They had heard that 2-note whistle again, this time coming from behind them, even though they had left no one behind to whistle and even though James Vetter was gone. And they had all heard it moving, heard it shift position across the pasture, calling the herd as if James was still out there, still pushing cattle toward home, still working the land, as if he had never disappeared at all. When they reached the fence line itself at late afternoon, when the sun was beginning to drop and the shadow of the thorn fence fell long and thin across the ground like a scar, they found the dogs lying down again, all 3 of them, pressed flat against the earth, their heads low, their eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the posts where the thorns grew thick, and the scrub opened onto land that rolled away into distance nobody wanted to ride toward. The dogs refused to move. They whined and they pressed lower, and when Garrett tried to pull Copper up by the collar, the dog began to cry, a sound that no tracking hound should ever make, a sound like pain, like terror, like something was standing just past the fence line where no one could see it, and something was calling to them in a voice they understood perfectly. By the 5th day of the search, the ranch yard had begun to look like a small town gathered for something no one wanted to name. Women arrived in the mornings with bread and coffee and beans that they kept hot in cast-iron pots. Children were sent to sit on the porch steps and told not to wander past the gate. The priest from the parish came out on horseback and stood looking at the smoking iron, which still hung pinned to the fence post, and which Garrett Coates had ordered left exactly where it was, untouched and unremarkable, as if it were just another piece of equipment. And the priest said a prayer that sounded like he was asking permission for something that had already been decided without asking. Kate sat in the ranch house with her daughters close beside her, and she did not cry or call out. She simply waited, the way a woman waits when she knows that waiting is the only honest thing left to do. The search had expanded into a grid pattern that covered more than 10 square miles. Men came from neighboring ranches. They tied more white cloth strips to posts and to the fence line itself. They dragged a hook through the shallow water tank, thinking perhaps that James had fallen in, though the water was only 3 feet deep and the bottom was smooth sand. They marked spots with chalk where they thought they might dig, old wells that had been covered, ravines that went down deep, culverts where a body might be hidden. The dogs still refused to move past the thorn fence. After the 2nd day, Garrett had given up trying to force them and had simply tied them to posts back at the ranch yard, where they lay in the dust with their eyes fixed on something distant that no human eye could see. On the 6th day, the whistle came again at dawn. Multiple men heard it this time. It was not a question of belief or doubt anymore. It came from the direction of the far pasture, from somewhere near the thorn fence, where James had ridden out. And it was his whistle. Everyone who had ever heard James Vetter call the herd knew that sound. It was particular to him, a slight hesitation in the second note, a rhythm that was his alone. And now it was coming from a place where James Vetter could not be. When the men heard it, some of them got on their horses and began to ride toward it. Others simply stood and listened. And when the whistle stopped, a sound came back from the searchline itself, the sound of cloth tearing, quick and deliberate, like someone moving along the fence line and ripping down every white strip they had tied, every marker they had placed. By the time the men reached that section of fence, all the cloth was gone. Every strip they had marked, every piece of cloth they had used to show where they had searched and where they had not, was gone. And in its place, beginning from the very first fence post and continuing in a line that stretched the entire length of the search grid, there was a path of newly tied cloth strips, white and new and clearly tied by hands that knew how to work with rope, leading toward the deep scrub and the thorn fence and the place where the land opened onto distance. "Someone's playing with us," one of the younger hands said. His name was Petty and his voice was shaking. "Someone's out there and he's moving the markers and he's—" "Nobody's out there," Manuel interrupted. He was very old, and he had seen things that young men had not seen, and his face had gone gray in a way that made Garrett move closer to him. "Nobody human is out there, because a human would have left tracks. And look at the ground where those strips are tied. Look at it. The ground around the new cloth strips was unmarked. No footprints, no hoof prints, no sign that anyone had walked there, worked there, or touched those posts. It was as if the strips had tied themselves, as if the wind had wound them around the fence posts in a perfect spiral pattern that no wind could have made. They brought the markers in by late afternoon, unwound every piece of cloth, and stopped searching. Garrett Coates called the men back to the ranch yard, and he stood in front of them with his hat in his hands and said simply, "We're not going to find him by looking." After that, the search changed. It became something else. Not active searching, but watching, waiting, vigil. Every night men took positions around the ranch yard and the near pasture. They carried lanterns that burned low and cast shadows that seemed to move on their own. They watched the fence line. They listened for the whistle. The women brought more food. The priest came more often, and he spent hours sitting with Kate, though no one ever heard them speak about James, or what might have happened to him. Children were kept inside after dark. No one spoke out loud about the cloth or the whistle or the way the ground refused to hold footprints where footprints should have been visible. On the 9th day, a note appeared pinned to the cattle gate. It was found by Manuel in the early morning, and he recognized the handwriting immediately. James Vetter's handwriting, careful and precise, the same handwriting that marked the ledger and labeled the cattle and signed his name when wages were paid out. The note said, "Check the fence line, the north post. Something is there." That was all it said. But the paper itself was old, not new, not fresh, but aged and creased, like something that had been carried in a pocket for weeks or months, and no one had left it there the night before, and no one had seen anyone approach the gate in the darkness. And Manuel, who had checked that very gate at midnight when he took his turn with the lantern, swore that the post had been empty then. Empty, and then by first light, written in the dead man's handwriting, the note appeared. When they went to the north post of the thorn fence, a post that was marked as a boundary line but nothing more, they found a second branding iron. It was identical to the first one. Same shape, same weight, same cross with the tail bent like an old man's finger. But this one was clean, not rusted, not worn, not marked by fire or use. It was pristine, as if it had just come from the blacksmith's forge, and it was still warm to the touch. Not hot, but warm. The kind of warm that suggests it was left there recently, minutes perhaps, by hands that had just set it down. When Garrett picked it up, he felt the warmth in his own palms, and he did not set it down again. He held it, and his hands began to shake. not from cold or weakness, but from something else. From the understanding that something had changed in the world he thought he knew. Something fundamental had shifted, and there was no explanation for it that made sense in the daylight, in front of witnesses, in a place where men worked and lived and paid wages and kept cattle. That second iron was carried back to the ranch house, and Kate was asked to look at it. She said nothing when she saw it. She simply looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked away. One of the women who was there, a neighbor named Mrs. Garrett, the foreman's wife, said later that Kate had gone very pale, paler than she had been even on the first morning when the horse came back without James. It was like she recognized something in that iron, Mrs. Garrett said, like it was a message, and like she understood exactly what the message meant. After that, the theories began to move through the hands like wind through dust. Some of the younger men said that enemies had taken James, that he had made a mistake somewhere, antagonized someone, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There are men out there who don't follow the law, one of them said. Men who work for themselves and don't answer to ranches or foremen, but the older hands, the ones who had seen more seasons and more deaths and more disappearances than they wanted to remember, said something different. The land out past that thorn fence, Manuel said one night when the vigil was quiet and the stars were very bright and cold. The land out there never gives back what it takes. That's just how it is. That's how it always was. Others whispered it wasn't a man at all that brought the cattle home. They didn't say it out loud, not in daylight, not in front of the priest or the foreman, but late at night when the lanterns were burning low and the men were sitting in small groups. They would say it in voices just above a whisper. What if it wasn't James that rode out? What if something else was using the horse? What if the whistle wasn't his at all, but something that learned to make that sound to call the cattle, to bring them back, to keep us searching in the place where we shouldn't be searching? No one answered those whispers, but no one denied them either. And by the 15th day, when Garrett Coates finally dismissed the search party and ordered all the white cloth strips taken down and all the markers removed, everyone understood that the search had changed into something else entirely. It had become a way of protecting themselves from something they didn't understand. The vigils at night, the watching, the listening for that whistle, these were not methods of finding James Vetter anymore. They were rituals. Rituals of fear, rituals of learning what you could not do, what you could not say, what you could not go near if you wanted to keep living in Laredo, Texas, if you wanted to keep working that ranch, if you wanted your family to stay safe and your children to grow up and your wife to not go pale in the morning and turn away from the sight of something warm and impossible and written in a dead man's hand. After that night, nobody in Laredo, Texas, crossed that pasture alone before sunrise. Not the young hands, not the old hands, not the new riders who came looking for work in the years after. On their first day, Garrett Coates, or whoever was foreman in later years, would take them to the fence line and say the same thing. You don't ride this stretch by yourself, not before dawn, not after dark. And if you hear a whistle, a two-note whistle like a hawk's cry, you don't answer it. You don't turn around. You ride back to the ranch yard and you tell someone where the sound came from. You understand? And they would nod, the young men, not understanding at first, but learning. Learning the way a child learns that fire burns or that water drowns. By being told and by hearing the tone in the voice of the person telling them and by seeing the faces around them that confirmed the truth of what was being said. The branding irons, both of them, were kept in a box in the storage room, and no one wanted to open that box. Not because they were valuable or needed, but because sometimes on cold mornings or in the deep part of the night, the people who worked near that storage room said they smelled heat and ash where there shouldn't be any heat at all. A faint smell, like something far away was still burning, like something far away had never cooled down. By the end of that autumn in 1923, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal on the surface, but underneath, in the way men moved and the hours they chose to work and the conversations they held and the places they avoided, everything had changed. A new hand came in November and Garrett Coates took him to the fence line and told him the same story. Not all of it, just enough. The young man nodded and said he understood. And he did work out alone in the morning, but never before sunrise. Never at that hour when the dark still holds weight and the herd is restless and a whistle can carry too far and mean too many things. By spring, that hand had left and found work elsewhere. 2 others came and stayed longer, and they too learned the rule without question. It became as natural as saddling a horse or checking a fence for brakes. It became as much a part of the work as anything else, woven into the daily knowledge of the place like the dry heat or the thorn fence itself. The story spread beyond the ranch. It moved into Laredo proper, into the town where the hands drank and bought supplies and talked to other workers. Ferrymen heard it. Carpenters heard it. Women in the market heard it from neighbors' mouths. Merchants heard it and passed it on. By the following year, it had taken on layers. Some versions said James had made a deal with something. Not the devil, nobody ever said the devil out loud, but something that lived out past the thorn fence and took men in trade for cattle returned safely. Other versions said he had simply walked into the scrub one morning and the land had kept him, that the ground itself was hungry, and that certain places never give back what they consume. A few versions whispered that he had not disappeared at all, that he was still out there, still riding the herd at dawn, still calling with that 2-note whistle, and that some mornings when the wind came down from the north, he was close enough to touch if a man was foolish enough to reach for him. The priest from the parish was asked once, years later, what he believed had happened. He was old by then, and he had already heard thousands of confessions and offered last rites to dozens of dying hands. He said simply, "I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped trying to make sense of it. I just accepted that God made a world with more in it than we have words for, and Laredo, Texas is one of those places." He would not say more than that. When he died in 1931, the knowledge of what he might have known died with him. Kate Vetter lived for another 37 years. She did not remarry. She raised her daughters and her son, the one who was born that next autumn, the one whose father never held him, and she worked as a seamstress in town, taking in mending and making clothes for people who could not make them themselves. She never spoke about James publicly, but neighbors said that sometimes late at night, they could see her standing at her window, looking out toward the direction of the ranch and the fence line and the pasture where the herd moved. They said she would stand there for hours, and her face held something like waiting, like listening, like every night she was hoping to hear a whistle that had stopped coming years before. She died in 1960, and they found no pictures of James anywhere in her house. No letters, no mementos. It was as if she had erased him, or as if she was protecting something by keeping no trace of him visible where other eyes could find it and ask questions. The ranch changed hands several times over the decades. New foremen came and heard the story and understood without needing much explanation. The fence line remained, the pasture remained, and the rule remained unspoken and absolute. You do not ride that stretch alone before dawn. In 1940, a young hand named Carlos Mendez ignored the rule. He was confident and restless, and he wanted to prove something to himself or to others. He saddled at 3 a.m. and rode out toward the thorn fence to move a few head of cattle that had drifted overnight. He was supposed to be back by 6. At 7 o'clock, his horse came back alone. The saddle was warm, the reins dragged. Carlos Mendez was gone. They searched for 2 days, but the older hands had already stopped looking by the afternoon of the first day. They knew. They had always known, and when Garrett Coates, who was very old by then, nearly 80, saw the horse come back, he simply nodded and said nothing. By that evening, no new hand was hired without understanding the cost of disobedience. Not just understanding it intellectually, but feeling it in their bones, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they looked at the pasture at dusk. The stories multiplied. Some people in Laredo, Texas said that what happened to James Vetter and what happened to Carlos Mendez was murder. That there were men operating in that region who made their living by taking what didn't belong to them, and that the disappearances were connected to something human and criminal and explicable if you looked hard enough in the right directions. These theories circulated in saloons and in back rooms where men who didn't work the ranch would gather and debate. They were logical. They were grounded in the world as most people understood it. No one from the ranch argued with them, but no one believed them either. Others said the land itself was cursed, that something had happened there long before James Vetter, something that had soured the ground or attracted something that fed on solitude and dark and the vulnerability of a man alone on a horse in the hour before dawn. This belief moved through the community quietly, passed from mother to daughter, from grandfather to grandchild. It was never preached or taught formally. It was simply absorbed, the way a person absorbs the understanding that certain streets are unsafe or certain waters are too deep. Parents told their children not to walk past a particular section of fence even in daylight. "Just don't go there," they said, and the children learned without asking why. The scar was cultural now. It was embedded in the behavior of a place. Still others, the very old men, the ones who had heard the whistle themselves or who had seen the branding iron still smoking in morning frost, they said something else entirely. They said it without using certain words, without naming it directly. But the meaning was clear in the space between what they said and what they refused to say. They spoke of the land as if it were alive, as if it had hunger and intention. They talked about the fence line as if it were a boundary that worked both ways, that kept something in as much as it kept something out. When younger people asked them directly, "What do you think really happened?" they would look away and answer with another question. "What do you think should have happened? A man rides out with cattle. He comes back or he doesn't. His horse comes back or it doesn't. His iron is warm or it isn't. Which version makes sense to you?" And when the younger person tried to answer, the old man would shake his head and say, "That's what I mean. There is no version that makes sense. And that's the only thing in this story that's honest." By the 1960s, the ranch had mechanized. Trucks replaced horses for some work. Fencing was modernized. But the rule remained, unwritten but absolute. No one rode alone before dawn in the pasture near the thorn fence. The new hands were told casually, almost in passing, "That's just how we do it here." Some of them thought it was superstition. Some of them thought it was a way to ensure safety and good practices. Some of them, after they had been there long enough to feel the weight of the place, understood that it was something else. A contract with something. A way of keeping a bargain that had been struck in 1923 and had never been renegotiated. In 1980, a documentary filmmaker came to Laredo, Texas, wanting to make a film about ranching history and folklore in the borderlands. He interviewed old men. He recorded their stories. He took photographs. When he asked about James Vetter and what had happened in 1923, he got different answers from different people, and he grew frustrated because none of them aligned, because they all seemed to contradict each other, because no one would commit to a single version of the truth. He left without making the film. He said afterward that the place didn't make sense, that the stories were incoherent, that the people were being deliberately evasive. But what he didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood from the outside, was that the incoherence was the point. The contradictions were not a failure of communication. They were a form of protection. The community had learned to speak about what happened in a language that allowed multiple truths to exist simultaneously. It allowed each person to believe what they needed to believe in order to continue living there, working there, raising children there, and not going mad from the knowledge that the world contained things that didn't fit into the categories of normal experience. People in Laredo, Texas still don't ask out loud what really happened that spring in 1923. They don't ask because they know that asking leads to answers that contradict each other, and contradictory answers lead to doubt, and doubt leads to the kind of thinking that can make a person reckless. Recklessness leads to a man riding out alone before dawn, and a man riding out alone before dawn leads to a horse coming back with an empty saddle and leather still warm and an iron that shouldn't be smoking but is. The mothers still tell their children, "You don't go near that fence line when the sun is down." The fathers still tell the young hands that you work in teams on that pasture. The priests still offer prayers when someone new comes to work the ranch. And the old hands, the ones who are still alive, there are only a handful now, very old, moving slow. They still sometimes look out toward the thorn fence on cold mornings when the mist is rising off the ground, and they listen. They listen for a whistle, a two-note whistle like a hawk's cry. They've never heard it again, not since 1923. But they listen anyway, the way a person listens for something they've been taught to fear and to expect. The way a person listens for a debt that has never been fully paid. Which version makes sense here? And which version do people in Laredo, Texas dare to say out loud? And which version do they only whisper when no one else is listening and the night is very dark? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.